today. Now, if you have been following me, you know that I have, of course, a desire to, help you along in a daily fashion. So, Lord, help us to do that today. We pray in Jesus' name. Well, you see, I grew up in a time period where my mom and my dad were, of course, from the 1930s. They were both born. My dad was actually born in, the early part of the 20th century, and my mom was born in 1930. They both grew up during very hard times. And so my mom and dad were very practical people. They recognized that, of course, if you were going to make it, you had to do it yourself. They also understood that there were consequences to whatever actions that you had. If you said something, you also had to follow through with what you said. You actually had to walk the walk, not just talk the talk. When I was a young lad, for example, we lived on a piece of land. It was in town, but it was a large piece of property. And my mom and my dad, every single year, they would put a garden in. And it was a fairly large garden. Now, we lived in what we would call, a turn of the century house. So in there, we also had what was known as a root cellar. In the root cellar, of course, my mom and my dad would store the different products from the garden. My dad had dug out a, root cellar underneath the house. And then every year, my mom would take stuff from the garden, and whether it was, different types of canning products or the potatoes that they would produce, and of course they would put it under the house, and then they would use that as a source of food for the entire year. So every year my mom and dad would make this great big huge garden, and then what would happen is they would then do that. Now, of course, my brother and myself, we were asked to, of course, do the garden. So every summer, for a couple of hours a day, my brother and I, and my older brother and my older sister, we would be out in the garden, and we would, of course, be doing the weeding, or we would have to, do the watering, whatever it was that we were called to do, we would do. And then after we would do that, we would go out and play and do whatever it was that we would do during that time. Well, you see, those were days of self-sufficiency. That's what I grew up with. My mom and dad didn't have an awful lot of money until later on, when my mom got a full-time job, and my dad, of course, was able to get a full-time job as well, along with his electrical business that he was also running in that small town in which we lived. And basically, that's what I grew up with. Now, it was interesting that most of the people that we grew up with had a very similar lifestyle. Most of the people of that generation basically said, if you were going to make it, you would have to, do it yourself. There wasn't a particular any handouts. There were a few families that were what we would consider families that lived on assistance, but that was not normal. That was actually more rare than most families. Also, growing up in southern Alberta, we had a lot of rural families. Now, of course, I happen to live now in a rural community. And part of my responsibility is I'm a bus driver, a school bus driver. That's what I do nowadays. I used to be, a pastor, and I used to be, living in the city for basically almost 15 years. I lived in a major city, and and doing broadcasting and other things as well. But now that I live in a small community, of course, that's what I do. So I bus drive. Now, interesting is that I live in an area where, of course, there's lots of ranchers and lots of farms. And we're not talking about small farms. We're talking big, huge farms. For example, last week, I had a conversation with a local vet. The vet of course, is generational. His actual great grandfather settled in our area back in the early 1900s or the 20th century. In 1905, his dad came over in 1905, or great grandfather came as a settler and he settled the land. Today, that family has 7 quarters. That is basically about 800 to 1,000, over 1,000 acres of land. And so that's a lot of land. And that's just the one family. I was talking with a young fellow the other day who's on my bus, and his family has been in where they currently are for generations, and they have, about 3,000 acres. My son married into a family that farms about 4 to 5,000 acres every single spring. So basically, the farms are pretty big. And my son, for example, has become quite a farmer. He's got a herd of cattle, over 100 head of cattle, and he farms about 4,000 acres, along with, of course, his father-in-law. And so farming is big. And of course, they have large gardens, and they do all of that as well. So I'm back kind of into that situation. Now you say, okay, you've talked all about this. What is the point? Well, the point is that, people in these areas are very self-reliant. They recognize that if you don't work, you don't eat. Now, of course, what has happened today, because of the society in which we live, in Canada, for example, we get free health care, and we also help new families move into the country. And it was interesting that today, because of the situation and the system, more and more people are losing, of course, what we would call self-reliance and self-sufficiency. Also, as well, when you begin to lose that community spirit, it happens more in the city than it does in rural communities. I know what I'm talking about because, like I said, I was involved as a pastor and also as well an individual that worked within that area for a number of years. And what I've discovered is today, more and more people, believe it or not, are becoming more narcissistic, more, I use the word Disney orientated. When I'm talking about Disney orientated, what I'm talking about is individuals who basically grow up thinking that the world revolves around them. And that's really unfortunate. That's happening more and more. And, who can we blame? Well, we can blame basically society in general. That doesn't mean that we personally have to be that way. You see, we have to make decisions on what kind of person we are going to be. Unfortunately, believe it or not, there's toxic people out there right now. There are narcissistic people out there, and they are selfish people out there as well, which is really unfortunate. And many times in our day-to-day living, we run across those people. And, sometimes you actually have to explain to people what they did was inconsiderate or what they did was wrong. Now, that is unfortunate because what's happening today is the moral compass of many people is, of course, slowly degenerating. That's what's happening. It's not getting better, it's actually getting worse. And actually, right now, we're living in a time period where it seems that the moral compass and also the consideration for others seems to be waning. Let me give you an example. On Friday, there was um, a legal precedent that was set in the United States, and it was basically designed against the administration in the United States because the administration in the United States was doing things that were illegal. They were doing things that were, basically wrong. And so what happened was there was a number of companies that brought a legal precedent against that administration. Well, what was interesting is the Supreme Court of the United States ruled against the president and the administration. So what happened was, now this is very interesting. What happened was, of course, one of the judges gave the president three different examples where he could level tariffs against the other nations. So what did he do? Instead of, taking the judgment against him, he called out all the justices that ruled against him, even ones that he appointed, because they said what you're doing is not right. So what happens is he then, in his announcement, and it goes on for a long time, basically says we're going to slap universal tariffs upon all the nations under this section, which he had was outlined in the judgment by one of the justices. Isn't that interesting? And so instead of abiding by the rule of law, he basically said, I'm going to do whatever I want to do because I am who I am. And basically, that's the world in which we live right now, where we have toxic, narcissistic, selfish individuals out there, of course, in power, making life miserable for other people. And even when, reporters will speak to this individual and say, listen, what you're doing is illegal. He says, I am the president and I can do whatever I want to do. And there's really nothing anybody can do because the people that I appointed showed me another way. And so now the world is dealing with more tariffs and also as well, a certain situation. So, of course, what happened was more legal challenges are, of course, put into place. And this is the world in which we live right now. And so when you have to explain to somebody that something is wrong, basically they don't get it. Or the second thing is they don't really care. And that's truth. You see, empathy is actually naturally within us. But somewhere along the lines, to many people these days, what happens is empathy is put aside for selfish ideas and selfish reasons. And you know what? You actually don't move with care naturally. All you have to do is watch 2-year-old kids. I saw it for many, many years. I was a pastor up north and in a place called Hay River. In our church, we had a couple of play groups. They were, groups within the community that rented out space in our church. And we had a large room, a kind of a community room. And there were two groups that had children. They were a play group, and the children were all under the age of 5. And we were at the time taking care of foster children, and many of our foster children were under 5. And so we would take the children to this play group. And it was interesting to watch the human dynamics of toddlers and children under the age of 5. So many times we would see children getting into scraps over toys or over, basic, little offenses. You'd have children all of a sudden getting into a fight. I saw more children bonk other children on the head. And then, of course, the moms and dad would rush in. And it was interesting to watch the parenting skills of each and every parent. Some parents said, well, you deserve that. And others said, oh, you poor little baby. And then the child would, of course, grab that. And, there's what we call positive parenting and realistic parenting. And if you are a realistic parent, you understand that you try to explain to your children that there are consequences to your actions. If you are what we would call a soft parent, what you would do is you would, try to protect them and put a bubble around your child. And unfortunately, your child will grow up thinking that, there's always going to be someone there to protect them and that there are not consequences to your actions. And so The balance, of course, is finding being there to support your children, but also as well to make sure that your children understand that there are consequences to what they do. We don't move automatically. And basically, if something that someone does to you, it bothers you, you need to tell them why it is that it bothers you. Now, there is, of course, two things to recognize when it comes to being offended. Let me tell you this. Every single day, you and I have an opportunity to be offended. It happens. You know why? Because we're living in a world where sometimes people are very narcissistic, selfish, and of course, looking out for their number one. But basically, most people, and I will say this, most people are pretty nice. Most people are. And I've discovered something about offense, and that is simply this, that 9 times out of 10, when someone offends you, they don't even know that they're doing it. And when you explain it to them, they say, "Hey, I'm really sorry. I didn't know." But there's always that one individual who doesn't get it or doesn't care because the world revolves around them. Somewhere in their development, they ended up, not caring about how they made people feel. There are those types of people. And when you are involved in a relationship with them, you're going to discover that they really don't care. And if it bothered you, if it bothers them, it also says something about the relationship that you have with them. And that's simply this: your relationship is something that they value, or it's a relationship of convenience. And you need to know the difference. When you really value someone, you will say that you are sorry. If you don't value something, or if you don't value the relationship, you say, well, you know, um, it's okay. I'm not going to apologize, basically. And so what happens is, very quickly, when you are in a relationship and something happens and someone offends you, okay, and you tell them about it and they don't apologize, basically, the value of that relationship. You know how they really think about you. And that says volumes to you. And that's when you have to make a decision. The decision is, okay, is this relationship important enough to me to forgive? Now, I want to tell you, you need to forgive all the time. You say, forgive all the time. That's right. The reason why you forgive is because you want to live your life without this person having power over you. You see, when you carry unforgiveness, it begins what we call a progression towards bitterness. You see, what happens is, and I'll tell you the progression of thoughts, when someone says something or does something wrong, the first thing that comes into your mind is, what just happened? Then you begin to think about that thought. It starts off as a thought. Then what happens in the progression of thoughts is you begin to think on the situation. You begin to rationalize the situation. You begin to look at the situation through perception and emotions. And then what happens is you begin to do what we call imagination. And in that imagination time, you rationalize and you begin to think to yourself, well, maybe they did this. You try to look for a reason. You try to figure out what is going on. And that's when actually some bad things or good things happen, depending on your view of basically life in general. If you have a tendency towards, of course, being hurt and taking on the hurt, then it becomes the next phase, which is a stronghold. You can either, nurse it. You can say, oh my goodness, that person really hurt me. You can rehearse it. That means that you go over the incident over and over again. And then you make a small incident into a big incident. And then it becomes a stronghold. And when it becomes a stronghold, you develop certain mechanisms that are going to protect you. And secondly, you are going to begin to, put a wall or a barrier between yourself. That's why forgiveness is so important, because when you choose to forgive, you are, instead of, rehearsing and cursing and nursing that thing, you are instead reversing and dispersing it. You're saying, I don't want this thing. I don't want this thing in my life. I don't want this person to have power over my life. I choose peace instead of, allowing this thing to become unforgiveness and bitterness. Because what happens is, when you get hurt, if you don't disperse it, it is going to colorize every single relationship that you have. Now, I'm not saying that you should walk through life, with walls up. What I'm saying is, recognize that every person in your life has the potential to hurt you. That's not being unrealistic. It's being realistic. But understand that no matter what anyone does to you, you are not going to do the same to them. You are going to treat them the way that you want to be treated. And that is a wonderful way to live. You are totally realistic. You are pleasantly surprised when people, deal with you the same way that you deal with them. But you're also not surprised when they have a tendency towards selfishness, because every one of us from time to time has a tendency towards selfishness. We all have that potential. But you can choose daily and with every relationship how you're going to act and how you're going to react. And basically, it comes down to awareness. So if you have people in your life that, are constantly putting you down, constantly draining you, because there are people that are in our lives that actually drain us. There are people that are in our lives that basically want everything from you. And when you don't give everything to them, they move on. We are to walk in love, acceptance, and forgiveness, but we should also be realistic with our relationships. We should put in parameters and boundaries. That's right. In relationships, you and I are to establish how we're going to act and react with people. And when we have negative people in our lives, we know how we need to act and we know how to react. We know how to work with them and when not to work with them. We know what if we want them in our lives, then we understand how we need to deal with them. That's because they will always show what kind of person they are, mostly in our walking back and forth together in that relationship. Now, when you have family members that are in that situation, you have to think things through. You have to say to yourself, okay, under these circumstances, am I going to, have a relationship with you? And if they are people in your lives that are toxic, if there are people in your lives that are putting you down all the time, you have to make a decision. And that decision is, do I want this person in my life or not? If you choose to have them in your life, then you have to have certain boundaries that are safe for you and safe for them. And if you don't want them in your lives, then basically, tell them, I don't want you in my life. And this is the reason why. And depending on the value of that relationship, they'll either say, okay, or they'll say, no, I want you in my life. It comes down to you and I. We have to decide what we're going to do with the relationships that we have. If we value the relationship, then of course we are going to be able to work within the parameters. If we don't want the relationship, there are some times where we need to just walk away. And that's on us. And we need to recognize that every relationship can be good or bad. We need to recognize that there is value, and also as well relationships that we need to, decide, is this valuable or not? That is our decision. And when it comes to relationships, remember, you and I can actually enhance a relationship by the way that we walk in love, we walk in forgiveness, we walk in grace. And I'm telling you right now, no matter where you are in life, I encourage you to walk with love, to walk with grace, to walk with empathy, to walk with sympathy, to better your world. That's what my encouragement for you today is. And if you run into somebody who you have to explain what they did was wrong, then you already know how they value you and that relationship. And basically, having to break down basic awareness can be draining because genuine consideration doesn't need to be taught. It shows up on its own. Now, when I first started this conversation, I was talking about two different types of generation. I grew up in a generation where people valued each other, that community was important. My mom and dad grew up in basically chose to live. My dad was actually from the city of Toronto, a very large city. In fact, it's Canada's mega city. There are between 5 and 7 million of people that live in Toronto. When my dad moved out of Toronto, it was already back in the 1950s, and it was already over 1 million people. So it was a large city of that day. My mom, she lived in the city of Calgary, and she decided to move down to the small town in which I grew up in. And they both made a choice to leave the large cities and, the impersonal part of it, to live in a small community because they wanted a sense of community. Everybody in town knew my mom, and everybody in town knew my dad. And unfortunately, many times they knew me. Well, the simple fact is that in a small town, and I am so glad that I moved back to a small town because once again, I have that sense of community. I know my neighbors. I know them very, very well. I can walk down the street completely and totally safe. I can take my dogs out for a walk, and everybody knows my dogs. We had an interesting incident last summer where my dogs actually got out, and a official from the town brought my dog back. We have a British bulldog, and they brought him back because they knew where he lived and they knew us as individuals. Isn't that something? That's the beauty of a small town. I've also lived in cities of 2 to 3 million people myself. I lived in the city of Edmonton for a number of years. And the city of Edmonton, of course, is a city of 2 million plus people. Now, that's just in the city itself. Then the surrounding area, of course, it gets towards 3 million people. Well, the simple fact is you lose, that sense of community in a large city. Now, I was fortunate that I knew my neighbors, and I lived in a neighborhood in the city that was fairly small in regards to, of course, the neighborhood. So it was wonderful to have that, but that doesn't always happen. So, the value that people place on each other, depending on their environment and also depending on their upbringing, makes all the difference in the world. If you grew up like I did with self-sufficient and also caring parents, then that is, of course, what was brought onto us. And that's what we brought onto our children. But not every family grows up in that way. And so we need to recognize that, in our day-to-day lives, we're going to run into different types of people. And we have to understand that very quickly, people will reveal who they are and how they view you. And then you have to make a decision about how you're going to operate in the parameters of that relationship. And, you know, every one of us are fairly intelligent, and very quickly we can learn how to do that. You can either be a positive influence or you can be a negative influence. You can be an enabler, or you can also be an individual that, draws parameters. It's up to you. But the wise thing is deal with everyone this one way. You say, okay, how do I deal with everyone? Make the decision that no matter what anyone does to you, you will not do the same to them. You will treat them the way that you want to be treated, even if they don't treat you the way that you'd like to be treated. You choose to raise the bar, and you choose to walk with love, acceptance, and forgiveness, but also with wisdom, knowing that you may have to walk in forgiveness a little more than you want to. And you also have to decide whether or not the relationship is valuable or not. If you decide it's not, then of course, walk away. If you decide it is value, then you also need to recognize that there are parameters in which you can operate, and you tell them. And even if they ignore them, you've let them know. My name is Robert Dean Steele. I want to thank you so much for joining me today. And I hope that through all of this mumbling and carrying on, that you got the essence of the message. And the message is simply this: no matter how anyone treats you, you treat them the way that you would want to be treated. Well, if you like what you're hearing, I always encourage you to press the like button and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Also, as well, check out my daily shorts here on YouTube. Every day I put a series of small, vignettes, snapshots, little messages that encourage and inspire your day. And actually what I talked about today was what I put on my YouTube shorts. I just expanded it a little bit. So you have yourself a great and godly day.